Good afternoon, everybody. I realize I am the last speaker. I'm the only person standing between you and I think a networking reception and then the weekend. Fortunately, we've got a really interesting topic. We're in a fascinating year with regard to politics and elections here in 2020, and that's what I want to talk about today. So let me give you a quick overview of the topics, and then when this video is done, I'm going to be around live, and we can have question and answers and engage in some dialogue. But I wanted to talk about the presidential race, obviously the U.S. Senate race, both the races nationally, as well as the McConnell-McGrath race here in Kentucky. We'll talk very, very briefly about the congressional races and also talk a little bit about the state house and state senate here in Kentucky because it's the last big election before redistricting. And finally, how we elect people. The election administration has been one of the biggest topics of interest in this election cycle because of the pandemic, because of the election interference from foreign countries in 2016, with all the changes that are taking place at various states and localities on how we vote. So a lot to talk about. We'll try to make it quick, and then, like I said, have some great Q&A at the end. But let's start off with the big race, the presidential race. I'm recording this before the completion of the Republican National Convention, before President Trump's formal speech on Thursday night. But I wanted to highlight a couple of different things. A lot of you probably follow the race. You maybe look at some of the polling, you've been hearing some of the messaging, but I want to talk about a few themes that you can look at as you're trying to figure out who's winning, who's losing, and what it all means. So the first thing is, let's just look at the state of the race. Now, polling is challenging in an environment where people don't answer their phones on landlines if they even have them, but polling is still meaningful and valuable. And contrary to popular opinion, the 2016 polling wasn't really off. The national polling was pretty accurate, and the state polling was right around the margin of error. The challenge is that the error was in favor of Secretary Clinton in the polls, while the actual election results favored now President Trump. But they really weren't that far off, especially when you consider the polls are a sample and all do contain margins of error. And so they really weren't that off. So what do the polls say this year? Again, with the caveat that polling can be challenging, but that's why relying upon websites like Real Clear Politics, which average out all the polls, is maybe a more helpful barometer than any single one poll. But right now, nationally, Vice President Biden has 6-8 point leads. It's been as up as much as 10, but he's got a sizable lead. It's really is a much more sizable lead than Hillary Clinton ever had in 2016, and is pretty big, especially when considering he's running against an incumbent president. If you look at the battleground polls, because at the end of the day, that's the race that matters, he has a smaller lead, but generally the polls show him to be 3 to 4 points, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, in the battleground states. And if all that held, he would win an electoral college victory comfortably. We're gone are the days of a Ronald Reagan 48 state landslide, like he saw in 1984 for Walter Mondale. But if Biden were to sweep all the battleground states, he would have a pretty comfortable win. That's essentially what Barack Obama did in 2012 and 2008. A comfortable electoral college win. But when you dive into those polls and look at things, you can say, well, they're still relatively close, and there certainly is an opportunity for President Trump to win. This race is not over by any means. So what about the conventions? They just happened. The DNC was last week. The Republican National Convention is this week. For those of you who are actually watching it, and I have to confess, I watched the NBA playoffs during the DNC, although I did watch Vice President Biden's acceptance address, and I've been watching the NBA playoffs until they started boycotting, in light of what happened in Wisconsin during the RNC. But I watched Attorney General Cameron's speech, our Kentucky Attorney General Cameron's speech, and I plan to watch President Trump's speech. But the rest, it's all for show. The ratings are terrible. Television audiences are tuning out, and the online increases do not offset that. So people really aren't watching the conventions, and this is an election where both sides probably don't need the conventions to bring the parties together. There's a lot of unity. The Democrats' unity is not so much because of Joe Biden. They're unified around defeating President Trump, and the Republicans are pretty unified behind President Trump, despite the fact that there are some groups like Republican Voters Against Trump or the Lincoln Project, or other variations of the Never Trump movement. The president does have a pretty sizable percentage of his party nailed down. Perhaps the RNC is designed to bring in a few more of those folks into the fold. But don't pay attention to the conventions. But there are some important things to pay attention to. Events on the ground. So, for example, I think what's going on right now in Wisconsin with the police shooting of the African American black gentleman 7 times. The video capturing it appeared to be an unjustified shooting, or at least 7 times seemed to be certainly excessive. The resulting violence and all that. Those kinds of events are much more likely to be make a difference in the presidential race than the conventions. So how would Trump pull it out? How would he get into the lead? I think 1988 is a pretty good analogy of where somebody came from behind to win. What you may not remember is Vice President Bush, trying to succeed President Reagan, a popular 2-term incumbent, was down about 17 points after the Democratic convention. Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis unified the Democratic Party, left that on a high, and a lot of people thought he was going to be the next president. Bush, at his convention, used his convention to articulate his differences with Reagan. He was going to look for a kinder, gentler America. And he also took a very strong, read my lips, no new taxes pledge. Both those steps were strategic. One was to unify the Republican Party. The second one was to bring back into the fold some of the folks who supported Reagan, but maybe were a little bit concerned about the impact on the safety net and other poorer Americans. Bush also was really not very well defined, even though he'd been vice president for 8 years and had run for president and held other positions. People knew of him, but they didn't know him very well. And so when they defined him, when he got a chance to talk about himself and his family and who he was, people grew to like him. And as that campaign played out, he played on his patriotism, his war record, criticized Governor Dukakis' record in Massachusetts on crime, even poking fun on the environment and the mess of Boston Harbor. You might remember the famous Willie Horton ad, which was a symbolic ad about crime that had actually surfaced in the primary. Then Senator Al Gore had run an ad similar to that and had mentioned Willie Horton in his ad. The Bush campaign saw that, put it in their ads in the fall, and then Bush ended up winning a fairly comfortable victory in 1988. So what is the analogy for Trump? Where could he do this? So one is, Trump did win an electoral college victory in 2016. Yeah, he didn't win the popular vote, but he won the electoral college. And so by focusing on those battleground states, it does give him a better chance. He's doing better in the battleground states than he is nationally. So how does he bridge that back? One is to bring back some of those suburban Republican voters who probably voted for him over Hillary Clinton. Maybe they voted for him because they thought he was the lesser of two evils, and they haven't been all that satisfied with his performance as president, especially his management of the coronavirus pandemic. But the message that might resonate, I won't say probably, but may resonate with those voters is pointing out how progressive, how liberal the Democratic Party platform is that, while Joe Biden seems like a good guy and somebody you might like, the folks who are going to lead the Congress on the Democratic side are going to pull him very far to the left and take this country in a policy area where you don't want it to go. The Democrats did a pretty good job of actually avoiding policy and focusing most of their arguments on Trump, on a return to normalcy and decency. My guess is that's where you'll see a lot of Biden's messaging throughout the rest of the fall. Republicans will try to point out the policy areas where those suburban voters who tended to vote Republican in the past would find more agreement with the Republican Party. The second is going to be to try to tie those policies specifically to some of the violence in the cities and the unrest. When the Black Lives Matter movement started again, this is something that actually started several years ago, but in the wake of some of the police shootings over the last few months, we saw protests, which started as not very violent, peaceful protests, and they were pretty popular across party lines, across race and gender and geography, things like that. But over the last couple of months, as some of the more extreme elements have been, seeing what's happening in Portland and Wisconsin, where there's some people just want to take advantage of this and create violence and creating problems and other kinds of things. That's something that some of those suburban Republican-leaning voters, some of those 2016 Trump voters, may not want. Now, the question is, will they blame Trump because he's the president during a time when this is happening, or will they blame, will they blame Trump and say, we're not going to vote for your Trump in America, or are they going to say, no, this is what's happening in these Democratic-run cities, and we don't want to see that in the fall. So expect plenty of messaging. We've seen hints of that in the RNC. I think that'll continue in the fall. Debates will probably be pretty important. Those do attract a large television and online audience, and we've seen them make a difference in races. In the 2000 presidential race, they certainly made a difference. So that's something to watch. But I think these kinds of external events will make a big difference. Think back to 2016. In the week before the election, James Comey sends a letter to Congress saying, by the way, I'm going to reopen the Clinton investigation because I've got some new evidence that I have to examine. He didn't say the evidence pointed to any wrongdoing. He just said, I have to examine it, and I told you if I was going to reopen it. That probably tipped some votes at the end of the election. So look for these external events. There is a pathway for Trump to win, but sitting here today, I think Biden wins. But it certainly is possible. If you look at the predictive markets, they are kind of along these lines where maybe 2/3 of a chance that Biden wins, 1/3 that Trump wins. So how does that impact us in Kentucky? Well, in Kentucky, we're up. Trump's going to win. Unless something really, really weird happens, Trump's obviously going to win Kentucky. But we do have one of the most competitive Senate races in the country, at least if you measure it by dollars raised. Amy McGrath, the challenger to Republican leader Mitch McConnell, has raised over $50 million. McConnell's raised about that much. McConnell jokes he's actually raised $100 million, 50 for himself and 50 for McGrath. That money will buy a lot of TV ads, a lot of online ads. It'll also pay for a great organization. And while most people, and I find myself in this category, don't think McGrath can win the race, her organization could help the Democrats down ballot and might cause the presidential race or even this, the Senate race or some of the other races down ballot to be closer than they would otherwise. She will not have any trouble getting her vote out into the polls, whether it's in person, by mail, or in-person early voting. There'll be a robust organization all across the Commonwealth, and we may see some down ticket impact of that. I expect this race to be a McConnell win in my mind. There's no doubt McConnell is going to win, but I'm not one who thinks he's going to win by as much as he did in 2014, where he had, I think, a 14 or 15 point win. My guess it'll be single digits. So the polling has been all over the map over the last month or so. Consistently shows him about 5 points behind Trump. I just don't see a scenario where Trump wins Kentucky by less than 10 points. And so to me, that means this race, while competitive and noisy, is probably never in doubt. If he's going to trail Trump by 5, Trump's clearly going to win Kentucky by 5. I think he's clearly going to win Kentucky by 10. And so he'll win this race. Next down on the ballot are the congressional races. There's only one that could be competitive. It's a little early to tell. Josh Hicks, who's an attorney in Central Kentucky, is running against incumbent Congressman Andy Barr. The Democrats probably think they have a little bit of a shot on here in this race. I think the only real shot they have is if McGrath polls closer than what I anticipate, and there's just a heavy anti-Republican vote that isn't necessarily, if you want to call it the anti-Trump vote among voters who might otherwise vote Republican, takes down, Andy Barr with it. Andy's had a tough year. He's a friend of mine, and I really feel for him. His wife tragically died earlier in the year. He had to take some time off from his campaign and his job to go spend some time with his 2 young daughters. But he's back out campaigning. There's an ad they put up recently, and I think that the voters of Central Kentucky will return him for another term. But don't be surprised if it's close. I think Hicks is a pretty good candidate. He lost the state rep race 2 years ago, but was impressive even in defeat, and has a shot. So that's Kentucky's big races. The other congressional races, yes, there's races. There's no doubt on the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth. All the incumbents will be returning to Washington. Nationally, it'd be very hard pressed to come up with a scenario where the Republicans can regain the House. The Senate was where the battleground is. Republicans currently lead it with 53 to 47. They're likely to pick up 1 seat down in Alabama. There's a Michigan Republican nominee in Michigan. Maybe he has a shot, especially if Trump can pull ahead in Michigan and maybe the economy picks up a little bit. We have some success with the pandemic and the coronavirus. But otherwise, there's no real Republican pickup opportunities in the Senate. They're playing a lot of defense in states like Arizona and Maine and Iowa and Georgia and a few other of these battleground states. That's where the race is going to be decided. There's 3-seat cushion plus the 1 potential pickup opportunity might mean was all is said and done, the Republicans were able to eke out a 51-49. But this is a 50-50 race, probably dependent on some of these national environments, some of these national events. and the top of the ticket. In some states, for example, in 2016, the Republicans' Senate candidates who lost, like Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, did better than Trump did, but not enough to get to 50% of the vote, and in part was dragged down. So, someone like Susan Collins may have that challenge, but we'll see. In Arizona, Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, is handily leading his challenger, Martha McSally, who was appointed to succeed Senator McCain at his passing. And Arizona looks to be a state where Trump is struggling, and a lot of Republicans, including the McCain family, have endorsed, not all, members of the McCain family have endorsed Kelly in his race. So the Senate's where the battleground is. As I mentioned before, I don't think McConnell's in any real danger, but he might find himself to be the Republican minority leader as opposed to the Republican majority leader after this election's finished. Also, one thing to watch is, will money and volunteers flow to the presidential battleground states, or will it flow to the Senate battleground states? Because it could be that some of the folks with money to spend and checks to write and ads to place will decide they want to support the Senate to keep the Senate controlled by Republicans. Because even if you have a President Biden, if the Senate's controlled by Republicans, that'll put a real constraint on the president's ability to get things done. Now, what about the rest of Kentucky, down ballot? We've got all of our state rep races and half of our state Senate races on the ballot. This election is the last election before redistricting, which will take place before the 2022 election. Republicans have large majorities in both chambers, and we anticipate that to hold. The Senate is 28-10, with the Democrats' most recent victory in the special election in Oldham County. Democrats are targeting 2 Republican incumbents, Philip Wheeler, who won in a special election in Pike County in eastern Kentucky, and a few surrounding counties. It's his first time running on a November election for the full term. And then also Chris McDaniel, who's the chair of the A&R committee, who's been in the Senate for 2 terms. He represents Kenton County, the northern part of Kenton County, Covington, and then some of the older suburbs. The area more or less north of 275, although it does dip a little bit south of there. McDaniel and Wheeler are by far the 2 top targets. Probably McDaniel is the one that Democrats feel like they have the best shot at. He's running against Ryan Alexia, who's a veterinarian in the Fort Mitchell area. First time running for office, not a lot of name ID, and this is a tough environment to get a lot of name ID. But that district is a 50-50 registration district, and it includes some of the suburbs where Matt Bevin didn't do very well against Andy Beshear. So the question we all have in watching that race is, will McDaniel get hurt by the Republican Party, given the fact that he's a Republican, as some of those voters who have traditionally voted Republican, or at least those precincts, not necessarily the actual voters, have been replaced by people moving in who are Democratic, or some of those voters who are in the suburban households, especially women, who have been leaving the Republican Party to vote for Democrats. That's McDaniel's risk. That's probably the most interesting Senate race to watch. He may lose that race for no fault of his own. He'll have a good organization, he'll have money. He's got an influential position as the chair of the A&R committee, but he's in a tough electoral environment. The irony is that seat the Republicans used to win because of being a Republican was helpful. It was the down ticket effect, the coattails effect made a big difference. On the state, on the Republican side, they're targeting Johnny Ray Turner, longtime state senator from Floyd County, Johnson County area. Was a coach and a teacher before that. Very well regarded by everybody on a personal level in Frankfort. But that's an area of the state that has become more and more Republican. He's running against Johnny Turner, a Republican, so there could be some confusion there. Republicans think they have a shot at picking up that seat. Turner was a 1-term state rep and is pretty well regarded. And as I mentioned, that district or that area has been trending more and more Republican. So it'll be interesting to see if Johnny Ray Turner's reputation and legacy and personality will, pardon the pun, trump the Trump down coattail effect that we've seen in that part of the Commonwealth. That's probably it in the state Senate. There's one open seat in central Kentucky. Julian Carroll is retiring. And Republicans, I think, had hopes of potentially winning that seat. But after the primary emerged, the candidate who won was not the candidate or one of the candidates that they thought gave them the best shot. So it's an interesting seat. Joe Gravis, the current state rep from Versailles, is running, and all open seats ought to be paid attention to. But Adrienne Southworth, who was the chief of staff for former Lieutenant Governor Janine Hampton, the Republican nominee, is not raising the money and getting the volunteers that potentially a different candidate would have gotten. But we'll see. It's not something that's an automatic slam dunk for the Democrats, although they'll likely win. So that'll keep the Republicans with a supermajority, the ability to pass a budget bill with a supermajority with no Democratic votes and pass constitutional amendments. I actually do a whole lot of things with still having some votes to spare. On the House side, Republicans control with over 60 votes out of the 100 members of the chamber. We anticipate that being the same. Most analysts, when they look at this, actually feel like the Republicans have more chances to pick up seats either by knocking off incumbents or picking up open seats. Maybe in Q&A we can talk about some of the more specific races. But if you just look up and down the ballot, there just really are a lot more pickup opportunities for the Republicans than the Democrats. As with all these other races, the Democrats' best opportunities are in some of these suburban areas. So you'll see them targeting incumbent state reps Jason Nemes, Kevin Bratcher, both from the Louisville area, as well as Deanna Frazier from Madison County. And Madison County was a county that was won by Governor Beshear in his 2019 race against former Governor Matt Bevin. But you'll see the Republicans target some rural legislators like Dean Shamor, Rob Wiederstein from Henderson, who's a first-term representative, as well as some open seats. Those seats formerly held by John Sims in the Flemingsburg, Maysville area, Rick Rand in Henry County, Trimble County, kind of leading up into the area between northern Kentucky and Louisville, and a few other open seats. A couple in eastern Kentucky, in Pike County area, in the mountains. Again, there's just more Republican opportunities to pick those seats up. We'll also see a rematch of the famous one-vote race margin in Owensboro between Republican DJ Johnson, who lost by one vote, and State Rep Jim Glenn, who won by that one vote. So we'll see how that plays out. But if you look at that, the likely scenario is Republicans probably pick up a few seats, which will again allow them to have that supermajority. And since we only passed a one-year budget in Kentucky this past cycle, that's key because in order to pass a budget in a short session, you have to be able to have that supermajority, those 60 votes to do so. And Republicans will then, in a year, will be able to draw the lines more favorably. Just like the Democrats have always done, that's just the way politics works. So it's a pretty important election cycle for both parties, but most people think that there's not going to be much of a pickup opportunity. And last but not least, how we're actually electing. Kentucky has been pretty typical among states where we are changing how we vote because we're in the middle of a pandemic. We've added no excuse in-person early voting. So for a couple of weeks prior to the election, including some Saturdays, Kentuckians can come in and vote. As well as if you're concerned about COVID, you can vote by mail without an excuse. There'll be an online portal that's now up and you can request your mail-in ballot and one will be sent to you. Most states across the country have seen some loosening of the rules to try to reduce the pressure on in-person election day voting. That's because it's hard to social distance on election day and some people don't want to leave the house or be around other people. We also will have poll worker recruitment challenges because so many of our poll workers fall into that category of a vulnerable population because of their age. And we also know we're going to have challenges with polling place location because some of the traditional places like nursing homes and schools and other places may not want there to be to be used as polling places. So you'll see each county have a mega location. The end result will be more votes cast in advance of Election Day. Now, this has been a trend all around the country. More and more states have been adding early voting options in person, have been adding vote by mail options, and so more and more of our votes are cast in advance of Election Day. One thing to keep in mind, just like in our primary, when you have more vote by mail, especially when you're in a state that generally hasn't had it before, so it takes longer to count and you don't have the infrastructure to do it, don't expect results in all the races across the country on election night. So we may not know who the next president is on election night. We may not know who's going to win some of these close races, and that's okay. We shouldn't be worried about that. But all across the country, we're seeing this happen where because of the pandemic, states are having to make changes and to adapt on the fly. If you have the opportunity to volunteer as a poll worker, do so. If you have the opportunity to vote early or to vote by mail, I would encourage you to do so as well. Just let's leave Election Day voting for those who need it. And if you do decide to vote on Election Day, don't be alarmed if the lines are really long. Remember, people are going to be spread out, so your line will look longer, but it won't be maybe necessarily more people in line. It might actually be less people in line. They're just taking up more space. So, whole host of things we can talk about in Q&A. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, engaging a little more of a dialogue. Sorry we can't be together in person like we were last year, but through this technology we can make things work. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.